Hello everyone, today I'll be talking about how the US hawks have suffered a setback. The US is planning to lift the ban on chip design software for China, and also, only China is able to impose counter-tariffs on the US. Now Trump wants Vietnam to unilaterally pay a 20% tariff, and this might set a precedent. The US's self-declared 90-day suspension of reciprocal tariffs will expire on July 9th. Trump has finally managed to reach an agreement with a third country besides the UK and China, and that country is Vietnam. On the evening of July 2nd, US President Trump announced that a trade agreement had been reached with Vietnam. This was the result of several weeks of intense diplomatic negotiations between the two countries, and the announcement came at a critical moment just before next week's deadline. If the two countries had failed to reach an agreement in time, the US had originally planned to impose a 46% tariff on Vietnamese imports. Trump issued a statement on his Truth Social platform saying, "I have just reached a trade agreement with Vietnam." According to this agreement, goods exported from Vietnam to the United States will be subject to a 20% tariff, while so-called export trade goods will soon face a 46% tariff. At the same time, Trump said that Vietnam has agreed to eliminate all tariffs on American imports. Trump said, in other words, Vietnam will open its market to the United States. This means that the US can sell products to Vietnam with zero tariffs. He also said that this agreement was reached after a phone call with Nguyen Phu Trong, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam. Earlier this April, when Trump introduced his so-called reciprocal tariff policy, he announced plans to impose a 46% tariff on Vietnam. Later, on April 9th, it was announced that tariffs on most countries would be temporarily reduced to 10%, allowing time for negotiations. In recent years, as many manufacturers have moved their production lines to Vietnam, exports from Vietnam to the US have grown significantly, and Vietnam has become a major supplier of textiles and sportswear to the United States. Companies like Nike and Lululemon have set up manufacturing plants there. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, last year Vietnam was the sixth largest source of imports for the United States, with goods exported to the U.S. totaling nearly $137 billion. It is reported that this agreement was reached under pressure from the U.S. on Vietnam. The U.S. side has asked Vietnam to step up efforts to combat trade fraud, strictly prevent export trade violations, and has also urged them to eliminate non-tariff barriers. Vietnam previously responded publicly, saying that they have already committed to removing all tariffs on U.S. goods and have repeatedly stated that they will increase their purchases of American products. To push forward the negotiation process, senior Vietnamese officials traveled to the United States to seek support and signed a series of agreements, including the purchase of $3 billion worth of American agricultural products. Vietnamese Foreign Minister Bui Thanh Son and Nike have reached out to senior executives of these American companies, seeking their support for the negotiations. Over the past decade, a large number of manufacturing industries have shifted to Vietnam, and this change in industrial structure has further increased Vietnam's trade surplus with the United States, making it one of the main targets for tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. Last year, the U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam ranked third among all countries, with Vietnam trailing only China and Mexico. In May of this year, Vietnam's exports to the United States grew by 35% year-on-year, as companies rushed to ship goods to the U.S. market before the final deadline. According to the full-year 2024 figures released by the U.S. Bureau of the Census and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the top 5 sources of the U.S. trade deficit are led by China, with the U.S. having a tangible goods trade deficit of $295.4 billion with China. China has maintained its position as the largest source of the U.S. trade deficit for many years, accounting for more than one-third of the total U.S. deficit. Mexico ranks second, with the U.S. running a $171.8 billion deficit with Mexico. Vietnam is third, with the U.S. having a $123.5 billion deficit with Vietnam. Ireland is fourth, with the U.S. trade deficit with it reaching $86.7 billion. Germany is fifth, with the U.S. trade deficit with it reaching $84.8 billion. But if the European Union is counted as a whole, the EU would move up to second place. Last year, the U.S. trade deficit with the EU reached as high as $235.6 billion, but when counted individually, Germany ranks fifth. Vietnam is the third largest source of the U.S. trade deficit, so it naturally comes under close scrutiny. There are a few noteworthy points about the agreement Vietnam reached with the US today. First, only China has dared to significantly raise tariffs against the US in retaliation, while among other countries that do not confront the US but have a large trade deficit with it, Vietnam is the first to reach an agreement with the US. The US unilaterally imposes a 20% tariff on Vietnamese imports, and not only is Vietnam unable to impose tariffs on American goods, it also has to reduce tariffs on US products to zero. This will set a precedent. Other countries with large trade deficits with the US will find it very difficult to negotiate a better deal with the US than Vietnam did. Japan is a similar example. In 2024, the US trade deficit with Japan was $68.5 billion, making Japan the eighth largest source of the US trade deficit. Even Japan finds it hard to achieve good results in negotiations with the US. Second, among countries that do not confront the US and have a trade surplus with it, one example is the United Kingdom. The U.S.U.K agreement set another kind of precedent. The US still unilaterally imposed a 10% tariff on British goods, and other similar countries will probably end up with the same result. Third, in the eyes of the US, China is an exception that other countries cannot emulate, which is why the US-China agreement is also not made public. After the negotiations among China, the US, Indonesia, and Asia, both China and the US reduced the tariffs they had imposed on each other after April 2 to 10%. However, the US had previously imposed an additional 20% countervailing duty on China, so on the surface, it looks like the US is charging China a 30% tariff, while China is only charging the US 10%. In fact, when China retaliated against the US countervailing duties, it also significantly increased tariffs on a large number of American energy and agricultural products, so China is not just charging a 10% tariff on US goods. For example, US coal and liquefied natural gas have been subjected to a cumulative 50% tariff in China. US chicken, wheat, corn, cotton hit with 50% tariff. Soybeans, pork, beef, seafood, fruits, vegetables subjected to 20% tariff. Agricultural machinery, crude oil, large displacement vehicles also had 20% tariff imposed. China's counter-tariffs on American products significantly impact the US. For example, in 2024, China imported $24.7 billion in agricultural products from the US, accounting for 14% of total US agricultural exports. American agricultural products are highly replaceable. If China imposes an additional tariff of up to 20% on them, their sales to China will plummet, directly affecting American farmers' income. For now, China is the only country uniquely able to counter the US in this way. China has also used restrictions on rare earth exports to force the US to abandon a series of measures against China. The two sides previously reached an agreement on this in London. According to a statement released by Germany's Siemens on July 2, the US Department of Commerce has informed them that they no longer need to obtain US government approval to conduct business in China. Bloomberg reported that this move by the Trump administration lifts the export license requirement for selling chip design software to China. Commentators believe this is part of a trade agreement between China and the US aimed at promoting the flow of key technologies. As one of the world's leading suppliers of chip design software, Siemens has already restored full access to its software and technology for its Chinese customers. The other two top chip design software suppliers, Cadence and Synopsys, have not immediately responded as to whether they have received similar notifications. It is estimated that they will all receive notifications from the United States. Bloomberg mentioned that in May this year, the Trump administration implemented export controls on China in the field of chip design software. At that time, the Bureau of Industry and Security under the U.S. Department of Commerce sent letters to several leading chip design software companies on May 23, requesting them to suspend shipments to Chinese customers. Christopher, who once served as a China affairs analyst at the CIA, at the time, Jansen believed that this measure showed that, although China and the U.S. had already temporarily reached a tariff truce, the Trump administration wanted to retain and continue to demonstrate its ability to contain China. He said that China successfully used rare earths to bring the United States to the negotiating table in Geneva, which made the China hawks and the Trump administration eager to prove that their export control tools were still effective. In addition, Reuters mentioned the issue of U.S. restrictions on lunar titanium exports to China. On July 2nd, Reuters also reported that the U.S. government sent letters to 2 energy companies that day, replacing previous restrictions imposed on their exports of lunar titanium to China. It is estimated that as China relaxes its supply of rare earths to the U.S. will also have to withdraw a wide range of minor measures against China. Previously, the Ministry of Commerce mainly talked about 3 measures taken by the United States. On June 2nd, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Commerce accused the United States of breaching agreements, stating that after the Geneva Economic and Trade Negotiations, the U.S. successively introduced a number of discriminatory restrictive measures against China, including, first, issuing guidelines for AI chip export controls. These guidelines warn the industry about the risks of using advanced Chinese computer chips, including Huawei Ascend chips. Second, halting the sale of chip design software to China, and third, announcing the revocation of Chinese student visas, among other actions. These actions have seriously undermined the existing consensus reached between China and the U.S. during the Geneva Economic and Trade talks. Now, it appears that after the U.S. lifts the ban on exporting chip design software to China, other measures targeting China will also be lifted one by one. To sum it up, after China and the U.S. reached another agreement in London, the U.S. will lift all restrictions on chip design software exports to China. This has greatly disappointed the hardliners on China within the Trump administration, proving that their export control measures against China have become ineffective.